When you hear Jewish and African American, what do you think? Do you think of Sammy Davis Jr., Dick Gregory, Lenny Kravitz? Or maybe you think of General Colin Powell because he speaks Yiddish. Well, these are interesting personal stories, but there's an entire history that links Jews and African Americans, minority groups struggling to carve out a place in this society. Racism and anti-Semitism are bound together like Siamese twins. When African Americans speak of systemic racism, we know what it means. Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and so many more who walked with them, have helped lead American society toward tolerance and coexistence. Today, we honor their groundbreaking examples of moral courage and leadership as we continue to challenge the white supremacy embedded in our world. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington changed the lives of millions of young African Americans in their building of more than 5,000 schools. And today, people continue their community life based on what had started in that school.
Gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my burden down by the riverside to study the war no more.
There are many personal stories across the U.S. South of Jews and African Americans that could cross the lines of segregation and prohibition and interact with each other. We have a particular one here. The great jazzman Louis Armstrong tells such a story in his own life. It's about his childhood. His father left the family when he was a child in a poor section of New Orleans, and his teenage mother worked long hours to support them. When he was 6 years old, in 1907, he began doing odd jobs in the neighborhood, and the Karnofskys, a local Lithuanian Jewish family who were recent immigrants, hired him for their peddling business. And more than just working for them, he says, he found a second home with them. He would stay at their house and eat at the end of the day. And he talked about learning Yiddish lullabies from Mrs. Karnofsky as she sang to her infant son David. In time, young Luis was singing the lullabies with her, and he learned other Jewish songs. The Karnofskys encouraged his interest in music, and they gave him the money to buy his first instrument, a cornet. It was with these songs, he said, that he learned to sing with feeling. And when he became a professional musician and composer, he reportedly used these Jewish melodies in compositions such as St. James Infirmary and Go Down Moses. Let's look at the history behind these stories. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, Jews were not considered white, which was defined then as WASP, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. In spite of that, the first two Jewish U.S. senators were from the South. David Levy Yulee was the first Jewish U.S. senator, elected in 1845 from Florida. He was of a Moroccan Jewish family, interestingly enough. Judah Benjamin from Louisiana was the second. Then the Civil War started, and there were Jews on both sides of the conflict. In what would seem like a bizarre instant today, in 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union Army expelled all of the Jews from the states of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky, which were under his command. When news of the expulsion reached President Lincoln days later, he immediately reversed it. After the Civil War, German Jews began arriving into the U.S. South as a part of Reconstruction, and many of them went into the cotton business. Some of them bought and sold cotton, and others set up cotton mills to process it, such as Jacob Elsis, who established the Fulton Cotton Mill, which is still a landmark in Atlanta today. While Elsis and other Jews were arriving to the South after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan was established to ensure white supremacy and suppression of the newly liberated black people. The South has been a polarized society ever since slavery, to the KKK and Jim Crow era, black and white, saints and sinners, wasps and non-wasps, us and them. This othering in Southern history was combined with violence by the extremists in the WASP world, attacking and killing both blacks and whites who would violate or challenge their doctrine of white supremacy and segregation. The first Jew to be killed by the KKK was Samuel Beerfield in 1868, just 3 years after the war ended, and a year after the KKK was formed. He was a man who socialized with blacks and sold to them from his store, and his end result was being attacked and killed. Samuel Fleshman was next in 1869, M.H. Lucy in 1871. Jews were seen as dangerous because they were enablers of black equality. 100 years later, this story of anti-Semitism and Jews not being accepted in the South was still repeating itself. Dr. Linda Goff tells of her father having similar experiences in the post-World War II period in the late 1940s and 50s.
I think of my father now in many ways as, quote, the hidden Jew. Because he moved south after the war and was a manufacturer's representative, my father went by the name of Arthur Brooks for 50 or more years of his life. However, he was born Abraham Blum, but he changed his name when he moved south to Arthur Brooks. And the reason for that was he knew at that point that there was tremendous anti-Semitism in the Deep South. But he would tell stories of going to small paint stores or hardware stores, mostly in Georgia and some of the other states. And he would say, you know, I would sit in the back stock room behind the store front area and sit on a crate and talk to the local owner, who was a native Georgian in this case, and swap stories, talk about X, Y, and Z, and my father would take orders for his business. But he would say to me, you know, if they only knew that here they were sitting on a crate in the back room talking to a Jew, he said, I'm not sure that would have sat well had they only known. And so here he was for the latter part of his life, hiding his true identity. And so those were some of the stories that I grew up with on based upon his experiences of traveling in the Deep South and being a Jew and having to hide that identity for so many years.
In the early 1900s, the KKK renewed its attacks on Jews and blacks, and we know the case of Leo Frank, who was falsely accused and convicted of killing a 13-year-old girl in the Atlanta pencil factory that he managed just 100 years ago. Although his sentence was commuted by the governor as being blatantly false and illegal, Frank was taken from the jail and lynched by a mob in 1915. The leader of that mob, Tom Watson, reportedly told Hugh Dorsey, the prosecutor in this case, quote, hell, we can lynch an N-word person anytime in Georgia, but when do we get the chance to hang a Yankee Jew? End of quote. After that, Watson, a well-known racist, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1920. Leo Frank was not the only Jew to be lynched in 1915. Albert Bettelheim was also lynched that year, along with dozens of black men. More than 300 people were lynched in Georgia between 1900 and 1930, and 3,600 in total were lynched in the United States. Jews were only a small percentage of people being lynched, and in no way comparable to what black people suffered. But Jews understand the horror of racist death squads. This was a time of growing discrimination against Jews in the United States. Harvard University and others had quotas. Jews and black people were not allowed in hotels or restaurants. Parks and beaches had signs saying no Jews, dogs, or blacks. And these still existed when I was young. Cartoons portrayed Jews as dirty, smelly, and unwelcome in the United States. In fact, in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act basically stopped Jewish immigration to this country. When Jews were trying to flee the Nazi atrocities and the death camps in World War II, U.S. law would not allow them to enter here. While discrimination against Jews was growing in the United States, one of the high points of collaboration between Jews and African Americans was about to begin. In 1912, Booker T. Washington invited Julius Rosenwald, the head of Sears and Roebuck, to join the board of trustees of the Tuskegee Institute. Rosenwald set up the Rosenwald Fund to finance the building of schools for African American children across the U.S. South. That secured education for 1/3 of all the black students in the U.S. South. Joyce Perdue will tell us about the Rosenwald School where her father was the principal, and some of the former students in that school will join her in telling their story of what it was like.
And so we have to really thank Julius Rosenwald for having the heart and the conscience and the will to help somebody else to repair the world. And if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's called Tikkun Olam. And what he did for mankind is amazing. It changed the whole landscape of an entire generation of people.
Did any of you attend the first grade school building that has just recently been restored on the hill?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, sure did.
Were you all first graders in that building?
First graders. Miss Josie Sams was our teacher.
Tell me what year, I know each of you maybe is a little older than the other or younger, but like when, Mr. Chubb, when did you go to the first?
1949.
49.
Yeah.
I was there
I
was there earlier.
Earlier than that?
Yeah.
Yes, I was there in 45, 46.
Wow.
And Miss Sams was my aunt as well as my first grade teacher.
My cousin.
I see a lot of interrelationships here.
Yeah.
So everybody's almost related, right?
Mostly, yeah.
Oh, mostly. Okay, that's great.
Mr. Hardy has a story to tell about that first grade building.
Really, I'd like to hear
The first
that.
grade building was separated from the other building, and the boys were separated from the girls. It was against the rule to cross the line and play on the girls' side. So one day, I was chasing the girl and went on the girls' side. Joyce's father, Mr. Perdue, saw me and called me in and whipped my behind. It was a violation to cross that line.
Wow.
Yeah,
So it was a serious thing.
It was serious.
Did you learn a lesson?
Very much so. I almost didn't like girls.
You never chased another girl,
I
right?
never chased another girl. At Fairview anyway.
Do any of you remember the closing of the Rosenwald schools in Cave Springs, and how difficult was it to transition to attending an all-white school?
I do.
You do?
It was awful.
Really?
Yes, the first couple of months, it was fights, names called, everything. I went home a lot of days. I told my parents, I'm not going to school back anymore. I'm not going to school. I guess I quit. My dad would say, well, if you quit, you get a job. Well, I knew I wasn't going to get a job, so I went on back to tolerate it a little bit more.
Did it get better over time?
It got a little better over time. they start accepting us more.
Rosenwald gave $62 million to seed these 5,300 buildings and school buildings and homes for these teachers, and millions of children across the South were able to acquire an education. And the Fairview School was one of those buildings. And education was the most sought after commodity within the Black community.
Such important leaders as John Lewis and Maya Angelou studied in Rosenwald schools.
I want to talk about the Temple bombing because it was one of those events that not only shook Atlanta and Georgia, but shook, I would say, the Jewish world in total. Atlanta had already been dubbed the city too busy to hate in 1954. And Atlanta and those movers and shakers in Atlanta really believed that. We had a series of very progressive mayors who were proud of what we accomplished and how we avoided problems of other large cities by working together. But when the Temple bombing happened, it came from out of the blue.
The Hebrew Benevolent Congregation of Atlanta, known as the Temple, is the oldest Jewish congregation in the city and one of the oldest in the South. Its bombing in October of 1958 shook the community. 50 sticks of dynamite caused major damage to the educational wing of the Temple, and the Confederate underground took credit. Rabbi Jacob Rothschild of the Temple was a known supporter of social justice and civil rights for African Americans. He was an ally with Dr. Martin Luther King. Some people think that, plus antisemitism, led to the attack.
It was a powerful lesson that hate speech is not harmless, and hate speech leads to real-world events.
Of course, the major turning point came with the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King, and the many who collaborated with him, like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. That movement led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the breaking of the system of segregation in the South.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
So going into an environment as a student at the University of Georgia was a shock to me in terms of clear racism and certainly anti-Semitism. So I pledged this sorority, became a sister in my freshman year in the spring. And one day after freshman English class, I was standing on the sidewalk outside of the classroom building. And I was talking to another student who was in my English class, a young African American male. Now, we had chit-chatted in class, and this one particular day, just standing on the sidewalk, I don't know what we were talking about. But at any rate, at that time, one of my so-called sorority sisters walked by, saw me standing there talking with this young man, and boy, did I get the evil eye. Whew. So it was either that night or soon thereafter, I was over at the sorority house for some function or another, and this same so-called sorority sister came up to me and said to me, in no uncertain terms, was a Sigma Kappa girl ever to be seen talking to an N on the sidewalk? And I looked at her, and after my initial shock, I believe I said something to her along the lines of, I will talk with whomever I wish. We are just friends and classmates, nothing more, nothing less. I left the sorority house that night, and I never set foot again.
When I was an undergraduate student in Atlanta, I also worked at Emory University in a special research project on social change. And one of the experiences I had at the Grady Memorial Hospital, where this project was being done, was that I invited one of the nurses to go to the cafeteria for lunch. And she said, Gloria, I cannot go there. I said, why? She said, no, because I'm black. And apparently, black people, doctors and nurses and everybody else, had to go to the basement of the hospital where their cafeteria was. So she decided to go. Later, in the bulletin of the hospital, they wrote about it, how this South American student had brought in a black nurse into the white cafeteria. I was appalled about it. It's still appalling to me, where is the concept of democracy and equality? I thought, and I think still.
A slow turn away from the Jewish community by some in the African American world began after the assassination of Dr. King in 1968. I was living in Atlanta at the time and doing volunteer work in the offices of Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I was the faculty advisor for the Black Student Organization at Georgia State University, and I was involved in community work in Vine City, an African American neighborhood. In the days and weeks following his murder, a curtain came down between the black community and those who were not black. The trust needed in collaboration had been deeply damaged, and for some it had been lost. And shaken like an earthquake, the Jewish and black communities drifted apart. Over the next few decades, international events also intervened to become wedge factors between Jews and African Americans. Although it might seem irrelevant, but the 1967 war in Israel became one of the important wedge issues. Some in the black community perceive the Palestinian people as a minority class like themselves. The Durban Conference in 2001 introduced the apartheid language, and many black scholars who had fought apartheid began to look at the Israel-Palestinian situation through that lens. That turned into open antisemitism for some thought leaders in the African American world, such as Alice Walker and Louis Farrakhan. Although Georgia has slowly turned from a bastion of white supremacy and segregation to a leader toward moderation over the last 100 years, the KKK and other white supremacist organizations are still active, as the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ADL, and other organizations document in their research. Given that, there has been a change. In 1920, Tom Watson, who led the mob in the lynching of Leo Frank, was elected U.S. Senator in Georgia. Now, 100 years later, in the 2020 election cycle, John Ossoff, a Jew, and Raphael Warnock, a black man, were both elected U.S. Senators from Georgia. And another interesting development, there is a younger generation of people of Jewish and African American descent, and they are exploring how to combine these two traditions in their own lives. One notable example is Adam McKinney, with a Jewish mother and an African American father, and he honors his African American grandfather in this sequence.
Hello, my name is Adam McKinney, and I'm the co-director of DNAWORKS, an arts and service organization committed to healing through the arts and dialogue. What you'll see today is 2 excerpts from Hamapa the Map Dance on Film, in which I have been going back to the locations of my ancestors and dancing there. In Box, I dance in 2 locations, Ouida, Benin, and Lewistown, Montana, and in McKinney, Forest City, Arkansas, and St. Louis, Missouri. I hope you enjoy. I was given my name, first man of day and molded into the spirit of 2, of both man and woman. I am Eagle Dancer, screeching from the sky, whole and full and all and not half anything, but 2, spirit. I am medicine person, orator, and keeper of sacred songs, historian, storyteller, leader, and peacekeeper. I name myself now in this place, Red Earth. And we are of the same blood, our chromosomes commingling, spiraling, moving, spinning. My great-great-grandfather, Jackson Davis, was born around 1870 in Mississippi. He was a sharecropper, and according to my aunties, bore the family name of his father's father, Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederacy.
And then there's me. I am the map, the quilt, and the tablecloth of those who have come before me.